Okay, so this is just my brief recap of the different types of literary genre, their definitions, and some hints about how to notice them. So our first option here is myth. Myth is a symbolic story that gives insight into ultimate questions about beliefs, natural phenomenons, or practices of a particular people. You'll notice a myth because usually things in the story will have deeper meanings, that's the symbolism, and they'll be trying to answer really big questions like, how did we get here? Why are we here? And things like that. Also, they might be trying to define why a particular group does some of the practices that they do. In class next week, we'll also talk about the creation flood stories that you read about in the intro to Genesis and how that's related to the definition of myth. Genealogy, a list or family tree of ancestors or descendants. It can serve as a link to the past or a bridge in between stories. This one's pretty straightforward. It's going to be a list of names and how they're related to one another. So you should be able to tell this one as soon as you look at the text because it's going to be a list of names and you can be able to tell some sort of relationship between them. Poetry. Poetry expresses the author's feelings about something, usually meant to be sung, and often includes refrains or repetition. Things to look for poetry. It's going to look like song lyrics, so it'll be set aside like stanzas, indented a little bit more in the page. You can look for repetition of phrases. You can look for examples of words expressing feelings on the part of the author. Or you look for something that tells you that it's meant to be sung. So if it talks about using instruments or a particular melody, or if you can find any sort of outside resources, maybe in the introduction to the book or the footnotes, that indicate that this text is meant to be sung. A parable is a short fictional story told to teach a moral lesson or religious truth. The message is more important than the details, which can change to preserve the message. You can tell a parable because the story will be short. You can often tell that it's made up because it might be very exaggerated, a type of story that you might think that's not very likely to have actually happened, but you also will be easily able to tell that there is a lesson to be learned from the story. So, big characteristics there, it will be short, often exaggerated, and there's a clear lesson or truth that you can learn from the story. A letter is a written communication between people or groups to answer questions, inform of events, or express theological insight. This is one where you want to seek some outside information, so maybe you might want to look beyond the short little snippet that I've given you of text. You might want to look at what book it is, look at the introduction to that book, maybe look at the first couple verses of that book and see if it's a letter, you're going to be able to tell who's writing that letter, who they're writing to, and maybe even the purpose for which they're writing that letter. Now, letters in the Bible are different. They have a very different style than our letters today. So you're definitely not going to see, dear group of people that I'm writing to. But you will be able to tell that it's a letter based on those outside factors of the setup and the introduction. A prophecy, to proclaim the words of God for the sole purpose of bringing people back to God. This is a hard one. Prophecy is not just about predicting the future, although sometimes it involves that. The key here is that if it's trying to bring people back to God, that means that they have strayed from God. So prophecy is usually going to be confronting people about where they've strayed from God and encouraging them to change their ways. Sometimes it involves threatening what may happen in the future that could be bad if they don't change their ways and return to God. A law code is a rule of conduct or moral code. Pretty straightforward. The thou shalts and thou shalt nots. These are rules about behavior, what you can and cannot do. A sermon, a speech on a serious matter given by a person of authority. The content is usually instructional, and the speaker may or may not have actually used these words. This is a tough one, so you might need to look around the section that you've been given. See who is talking, see if it's a person of authority, see what they're talking about, see if their content is trying to teach people something, and if what they're trying to teach is serious. Usually for a sermon, there will be some sort of context clue in the text. You just might have to look for a cue word that you might find, maybe before or after the passage you've been given. Proverb is a brief statement of general wisdom. You'll be able to identify these pretty quickly because they will be short and they will be wise. Maybe not wise to you and me today, but they will be considered to have been wise statements, at least in their day. A modern, well, maybe not super modern, but things like a stitch in time saves 9. I don't even know that I know what that means, but that would be an example of a proverb because it's a short statement meant to convey some sort of wisdom, although one that's been lost at least a little bit in time. Apocalyptic. All right, this is another tough one. Figurative writing to encourage faith during times of trial, often not always concerning end times. When I say figurative writing, it means it's going to paint a picture with words. It's going to be very descriptive, and it's going to be trying to encourage faith, trying to say, hang in there. It may be talking about the end of the world, not all of the time, but if it is, that's often a good indicator that it's apocalyptic writing. Historical biographical narrative are stories that record what God or Jesus did to and through people. Authors use traditions and stories from the past to teach or illustrate a religious message, and the main focus is the message of faith over historical accuracy. So these are going to be stories about things that happened either in people's lives, that would be biographical, or events that happened, that would be historical. But the key here is that the writer's focus is not about preserving exactly what happened, but rather about showing how God was active through that person's life or through that historical event. Meaning that because of the influence of the oral culture, it would be considered perfectly acceptable to adjust some details in order to make it more clear how God was at action in the people's lives, even if that sacrifices a little bit of historical accuracy. An epic. Okay, here's where we get into the new ones that we haven't talked about yet. An epic is a long, exaggerated, and idealized narrative about a hero or heroine who goes through various trials. I've underlined here hero or heroine. Heroine is just a female hero because there's going to be another genre really similar to this in a moment. And so the one way to remember epic is it's going to be focused on a person. So these are very long and sweeping. Obviously, you won't be able to tell that they're long if you're only reading a tiny snippet. So you're going to have to look for the fact that this is going to be really exaggerated and idealized. The point of the story is going to be to make the hero look really good, really airbrushed and kind of flawless. Maybe there might be some flaws in there at some point, but they kind of look larger than life. So even though they're going through various trials, they kind of always come out on top. A military history are biographies, autobiographies of soldiers, and accounts of battles, campaigns, and wars. So basically, if you're reading a story about some sort of battle or about some sort of strategy used in battle, that is going to be the sign that you're reading a military history. An allegory is a story with symbolic characters that presents religious truths. The way to tell an allegory is usually every character in an allegory represents someone else. So they're all symbolic. So if you've ever read Animal Farm, Animal Farm is a story about a bunch of animals on a farm. But actually all of the animals represent people and events in history. So you can read the story in and of itself and it seems to be just about a bunch of talking animals on a farm, but actually it's symbolic and it's speaking about actual events and people because all of them are symbolically representing outside figures. The footnotes can help you out on that too. If you see a lot of examples of this character represents something else or someone else. And then finally we have a legend, which is a story which has a historical kernel of truth but has been greatly exaggerated in order to inspire its listeners. This is the one that's really similar to an epic, and you've noticed I've underlined the word story here, whereas the epic focuses on the person, the legend focuses on the story. And so here, maybe something very much at the heart of the story was true at one point, but in being told over and over again and exaggerated, it's really kind of been blown out of proportion. I think about a fish story, right? So if someone caught a fish, but every time they tell the tale, the fish gets a little bit bigger. So yes, they did actually catch a fish, but by the time they've told the story so many times, the fish is so big, it's become so exaggerated that it's out of proportion. What makes it a legend, though, that is not the case in my fish analogy, is that the purpose of all of this exaggeration is to inspire its listeners. So the purpose of all the exaggeration is to kind of psych the listeners up to do something or to follow someone. That's why it's being exaggerated. Okay, so hopefully this information will help you out. Some things to keep in mind. This is a difficult assignment, so just do the best that you can. Everything's going to be used at least once, so if you find one particularly difficult, skip it, do the rest of them, and see what's left over, and that might help you narrow your search. Use outside sources within the Bible, like your intros and your footnotes. Good luck. I hope that making this on a Friday night, hopefully all of this made sense after teaching all week, and I hope that you have a fantastic weekend. Thanks for listening.